Hello friends, this is Waylon of Elephant. And we're now live on Facebook, Instagram, and I am here today, Sunday, with Noel McLellan. Is that your name?
That's my name.
Yeah. We just met like 40 years ago. So Noel is a childhood buddy and a teacher. And you're teaching, where do you teach?
I teach in Halifax, Nova Scotia. My school's called the Shambhala School, and I've been there for 15 years.
15 years,
Yeah,
wow.
I know, time is crazy.
That is crazy.
I teach middle school and high school, mostly English and history.
And we're here today because you just wrote a book. I'll show that to the camera. So what's this book called and what is it about?
Yeah, so this is my book, Teaching with Bravery, Meditation and Heart Advice for Teachers. And it's really a kind of a guidebook to the inner life of teaching. Mm-hmm. And it's a book that I wrote to bring together my own spiritual path, I guess you could say, and Shambhala principles from the Shambhala tradition.
Which is related to Buddhism or meditation, that kind of...
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Which is the tradition that we both grew up in, of course. Yeah. So with the experience, my experience of being a school teacher. Yeah. And so some years ago, maybe 5 years ago, after I'd been teaching for about 10 years and had been doing meditation practice for 25 years or something like that, I started to work a little bit with teachers and teaching them meditation and some of these principles and talking about my experience and working with them. And so this book really grew out of that work.
Do you mean you like transcribed talks, or it was just inspired by that experience?
It was more inspired by that experience. It seemed like what I was sharing was being well received. People were saying it was different from other things that they had encountered. Yeah.
So I haven't read too many teaching books about teaching, but reading this, not being a teacher, but having worked with children a little bit, but even without that experience, it's incredibly readable. It feels like reading a Pema Chodron book, which in my world is the highest compliment. So I've asked you this off camera, but who is this book written for? It's written for teachers.
Right. Yeah, it's really for teachers, anyone who works with young people. That's kind of the primary audience. Yeah. But really, as you've probably seen, the principles are pretty much applicable to anyone who's interested in how you might develop a personal practice of meditation, and especially how you might mix that practice with your activities in the world, particularly working with other people. So it's very much about relationship, and that's what teaching is that's sort of the building block of teaching in the classroom. Is you're in relationship with your students, and that's really challenging. From a meditation is usually a very solitary thing, but the truth is most of our life isn't very solitary. So we have to kind of bring those together quickly, you might say. So yeah, it's very much about how do you learn to meditate and develop yourself, but also how do you bring that into chaotic situations and lively, volatile situations.
That's what you mean by we need to bring them together. Bring together your solitary, peaceful meditation practice. Don't just leave it at home.
Right, exactly.
And bring it into the chaos that is, I imagine, a daily school.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Yeah. And it also feels to me like a little bit like secretly it would be fun, maybe not cool, but it would be fun or helpful to read this when you're a kid yourself. Like it feels super helpful, like it's presenting children not in some naive idealistic way, but as fundamentally good. Maybe you could tell us about basic goodness.
Sure.
Or innocence principle
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's a good question, and I actually did vet some of the chapters with my children. Yeah,
so it shows.
So I have a 13-year-old son and a 9-year-old daughter. Yeah. And I wanted to see how they would respond to it. They chuckled a little bit. They were able to follow it and respond to it and tell me where they got lost, actually, so it was very helpful. And but ultimately they were like, yeah, I get it. We were able to converse about it. Yeah. They thought it was a little boring, but other than that, it worked.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, the basic premise.
You should have had their reviews on the back.
Yeah. Yeah.
Workable. It's
all
right.
Boring.
A little boring.
Exactly. The basic premise of the book, the foundation of the book, is this core principle from the Shambhala tradition of basic goodness. And that's the notion that if we really look into our being through our kind of surface proclivities and biases and thoughts and all of that stuff, we find some kind of openness and some kind of fundamental worthiness and something which is trustworthy, I guess you could say, and which is really fresh. And so that's where I talk about in here the idea of innocence. It's almost like we all have the ability to go back to that quality that you have when you're a child, where you perceive the world in a really magical way.
Right.
And it's like you can see it in very young children especially. It's like you see them looking at things and you realize they've never ever seen that before.
Yeah.
They don't know what it is, and it's marvelous to them.
Yeah.
And even just looking at them, you start to remember it, so you start to have that a little bit.
Right.
But through the course of our lives, most of us sort of put layer upon layer upon layer of preconceptions and habits to the point where we literally barely experience our lives anymore. We just experience our own layers of thoughts and fears and so forth.
And we even conceptualize or Instagramize anything, any present moment we do have. We're like, look how beautiful that thing is, and we put our phone in front of it.
Exactly, yeah. So
which isn't bad, right? But it's something to be aware of, right?
Yeah, right. Sort of capturing it and making it solid. And, exactly.
Yeah, and you're not talking about these magnificent mountain views wake you up to your life, which they do.
Right.
But you're talking about these little moments, like in the book you say, the tear on a billboard, or like any little thing, how your coffee and your milk are mixing or something.
I think a lot of the time we kind of are in our life in a way where we sort of move through our life as if we're the protagonist in our own story.
Right.
And so, you could go out and go to the store and buy a jug of milk and come back, and then that's it. That's the story, right? So I went to the store, and so if you're writing a story, that none of that would get in the story because it's not very interesting. But it's also not a true story. What actually happened, right? You went to the store, but you opened the door first. You stepped outside. You probably felt the air touch your face. You looked up. You saw the sky. Maybe you caught a little whiff of autumn in the air. Then you turned to the corner. You heard the sound of your foot on the gravel. Right? None of those things matter from the perspective of you and your narrative, where you're going in your life story, but they really matter from the point of view of just being a human being and being alive.
But why do they? Why is that key to understanding how to connect with the children?
Oh yeah, good. So I think why is because if we can kind of go back to a sense of honoring our experience, our actual experience as human beings, then that becomes a foundation for how we can honor it in the other people we interact with. So a lot of the time in the education world, there's sort of another narrative, which is honestly, it's a little bit like you're stupid, right? You're uneducated. In
conventional education.
Yeah.
We need to fill you with this good knowledge.
And if you become educated, you could become worthy, right? You could become a worthy member of our society or community. You could be successful. A lot of times it's told more in a negative way, better make sure you don't end up, stuck in some dead-end job, right? It's sort of this fear-based thing. But if you do these things, you could get out of that hellish destiny of yours or something.
Right.
So this is kind of turning
and
that
even the positive side is some sort of weird ambition,
totally.
You could get this great job if you do this.
Yeah, you could win and all of that.
Yeah.
So this is kind of turning all of that on its head and saying, actually, you're worthy already, you're intelligent already, and therefore you could learn things. So with that as your foundation, what does it mean to learn? And so rather than kind of inspiring a lot of kind of inadequacy and fear, and then trying to use education to kind of remediate that. You're starting from a place of like, you're fresh, you're good, and actually then learning becomes much more delightful and kind of open-ended too.
Do you actually find that in your classroom?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, a lot of what I talk about in the book, and I'm fortunate to work in a school where we're able to implement a lot of the things, is that if the culture supports that perspective, if the culture and the environment kind of says, we trust you fundamentally, and we care about you fundamentally, then there's this kind of relaxation that happens. You see the students just sort of relax into themselves. And it allows them to have a much more capacity to pay attention to learning and all of that kind of stuff, because they're not so bound up in like worrying about how they present themselves and worrying who's going to judge them and all of that kind of stuff.
Or acting out is often, probably on some level, they're like trying to get out of a cage that they've been put in by other people.
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah. How do you relate? Like every classroom, my mom would say, like, would have a lot of great students and they were great, but she was always like, really loved the troublemaker. She didn't want too many of them per class because then that took over. But how do you relate to, a student who is acting out or who maybe has a rough, I mean, that's what a lot of teachers are going through. Their students maybe didn't eat breakfast or don't have a good home life or sleeping in class or on their phone. Or how do you relate to someone who's just not that interested?
Yeah, well,
not
I think,
open,
kind of what you were gesturing to there, to me, is really the first point, which is like, before you can even get to what's a good practice of discipline and so forth, teachers need to start by looking at their own state of mind, because very much of the time, what they're responding to and dealing with has much more to do with them than it really does with what's happening in their classroom.
Right.
So, which is understandable. It's so many teachers teach in very overwhelming circumstances.
Yeah.
But if you're overwhelmed, you're totally stressed out, you have this agenda that you need to get through, and then somebody's disrupting it, a lot of how you're going to feel about them is just negative.
Right.
You're just going to feel like that's messing up my agenda.
Yeah.
You're disrupting the whole plan, and so you get angry.
And they are on some level.
Definitely.
Like, you're trying to help all these children, and then someone's like full of energy and anger or whatever it is.
Right.
Yeah.
So we all like the notion that like, oh, actually that disruptive energy is creative in some way. Or that's another form of communication. You can get into thinking of it that way if you yourself are already kind of like, you could say regulated, or you've already kind of made friends with your own state of mind.
Yeah.
Because if you've made friends with your state of mind, then the outer circumstances aren't really such a threat to you.
Right. But if you're feeling like, look, I'm getting paid $40K or $50K, I'm working way more than full time, I'm buying some kids breakfast or textbooks, I don't really know the experience, I'm being regimented from on top with these test results and teaching to the test.
Right.
Like, that's a lot of like rich ground for, I would think, for kind of irritation or self-pity when some student is giving you a hard time.
Definitely.
On top of all of that.
Yeah, very much so. And I feel really sympathetic to teachers. It's a big part of why I wanted to write a book, to be supportive of teachers.
Yeah.
Sort of my dream for this book is that like a teacher would keep it on their desk, and in their like spare 5 minutes, might read a little chapter and just have some breath of fresh air or some reminder of like, why did I ever want to do this?
Right.
And have some...
That's beautiful. Because there is some fundamental thing in teachers, right, that they, at some point, actually really wanted to do this.
Most teachers have that kind of heart of service. Yeah. That heart of service, and then sometimes that gets crushed by the difficulty of working in those circumstances. Yeah. And in some ways, that's the saddest thing, right? Is like when somebody's that heart kind of gets lost, and then people lose their feeling that they can be helpful.
Right. You're just trying to get through the day on some level. Yeah. Yeah.
And I work in a kind of idyllic situation compared to a lot of teachers, and I feel that. Yeah. Like I lose heart all the time. So it takes.
You're a small school. You have financial issues. You have a front yard that is like closed down legally because
Right.
of some ridiculous thing.
Yeah.
Like you have probably complicated parent-student stuff going on. It's endless, even at a good school.
That's right, and like even if you have 3 students, each of them could take all of your energy.
Right.
They would deserve all of your energy.
Right.
And every single person these days, not these days, it's always been this way, but to me it's even more heightened now because the world is so saturated in information. You really see students now that they carry the weight of the world with them. So people are aware of the challenges of our global society, and they're young, and they're feeling that.
Right.
They might not be able to articulate it. They might not be like, I'm sad today because I heard these horrible statistics about climate change.
Right.
But, one of my friends once said, like, this is the one place where trickle-down theory is actually true. Like that students, kids and youth actually are feeling like the energy of the world as it gets to them. And so, it's a lot. It's a lot.
Yeah. It's funny because like when we went to a Buddhist-inspired Shambhala school growing up, and we had all of our obstacles, friendships and studies and whatever, but we didn't have this overwhelming kind of context of climate change. We didn't have this overwhelming context of school shootings. Yeah. We didn't have this overwhelming daily context of phones in our faces at all times.
Right.
Comparatively, it was like, it's easy to get nostalgic.
Right.
Because it was just as wonderful and just as messed up. That's sort of the human condition.
Right.
But it was less, there were fewer layers maybe between us and that simple present moment you were talking about.
Yeah, that's true. Well, you're right. We were lucky. We had a creek behind our school.
Right.
And we used to splash around it and catch water skippers and stuff like that.
Right.
And at the same time, it's true. Like, I kind of hated school. Yeah. All the way through. And it was like, in retrospect, I look back and I was like, oh, I was really lucky. But at the time, I felt like I was miserable and stressed out. And
Yeah. Yeah, so I guess I felt that going into your book, thinking about the educational system now with all the pressures on it, the lack of support for it. There's a certain amount of like, it's hopeless. Like there's some depression in what I brought to this book was some sense of like, even if you do all this great stuff, you're still within this messed up educational system. Yeah. And then you directly address that, like in the first or second paragraph, chapter, saying, you can focus on the problem, or you can focus on actually there's still a lot of beautiful potential in every classroom.
Yeah, I think, a big premise here is that are we trying to work from the outside in, or do we work from the inside out? And if we're looking to our circumstances to confirm us and to say like, oh, it's all good, and we should feel good because the whole situation around us is telling us that. Mm-hmm. That's a very fragile premise to work in any circumstance. So the real emphasis to me is like you have to start to work on your own experience. Work with your own state of mind, your state of being a human, really, and out of that can come a feeling of bravery. And that feeling of bravery means that you have, first of all, just some sense of confidence in the goodness of the heart. And then it's kind of like you might be surrounded by circumstances, but, and believe me, I don't feel this way all the time, but you get glimpses of it where it's like, it doesn't matter how bad it is. Those are just like opportunities for you, because you have this kind of, you have something to offer, honestly, is what it is that deep down you really feel like you have something to offer. And where does that come from? It comes from this sense of being really tender about your own personal experience and feeling like joyful about your own experience. And then you want to invite people into it because it's not something that's like your accomplishment. It's not that you feel like, oh, I'm so special, therefore I experience this. It's actually the opposite. It's like, oh, this is totally ordinary. I'm nothing special, and yet I've discovered something good in myself. Therefore, I know that you have it, and you can see it in other people. To the extent that you can feel that within yourself, then you automatically can see it in your students. And when you see it in your students, they start to intuit it a little bit. They start to intuit, like, they don't see me as everyone else sees me. They're maybe not measuring me based on my personality, based on my grades, whatever those usual markers are that they're used to being judged by. And in some ways it's kind of disruptive. It's kind of like, well, what are they basing, But it's actually like, it's nothing. It's just like, you're a human and I see you. And that's so rare in the world these days. You, as a teacher, you have the opportunity to, in many cases, be the only one who is offering that to that person.
Right.
And, therefore, that's what keeps me going, is like, I don't always live up to that, but knowing that that's possible, it feels very worthy. It feels very compelling.
Sure. So, but that could also lead to burnout, I would think, because you have this feeling of like, this is really urgent in a positive way. Like, this is really needed. Like, I really need to show up. I can actually help. Like you were saying, I have something to offer and share. But then you feel like you never want to stop on some level, right?
Right. Yeah. No doubt. And burnout's so common with teachers. And so, a lot of what I talk about in this book is meditation practice. And meditation practice is so essential because having like an altruistic intention is one thing.
Right.
Having these good ideas, being inspired, but they don't have resilience on their own.
Right.
So meditation is where that resilience comes in.
You can go in with the best, powerful kind of like skill. Yeah. And it'll fall apart.
That's
like,
right.
Kids are so pro at finding the trip, it's just a trip on some level.
Yeah.
And they just kind of
exactly.
tear it apart.
Exactly. Yeah, so what a lot of teachers do to compensate for that, and it's understandable, is they sort of just learn more and more professional methods, which, a lot of them are great. Right. It's not that there's any problem with them. But if you're kind of using those to compensate and to protect yourself,
like armor, like further plates of...
You're just sort of armoring up, and you have these weapons, and you're like, because it's working, therefore I won't burn out. Somehow it doesn't really compensate for the fact that, like, you're still a human being, and you still have a heart in the situation, and you're still feeling the rawness that is there. And you feel the rawness of your students' experience in addition to your own, whatever your own agenda is, like, I want to save all of them, and then you're frustrated because you can't or whatever. But you kind of carry all of that, so meditation practice really allows you to kind of keep coming back to something much more simple and basic, and to kind of let those things drop to some extent, without detaching from them. So, coming back actually to the kind of simple caring as well.
Right. So do you, I'm sure you get this question all the time, but do you actually meditate in the classroom? Or do you just kind of do that at home? You're kind of unarmored up for the day with your meditation.
Right.
And carry that through. Yeah,
well, so in my school we practice meditation. But it's so varied what's possible from school to school, whether they have a program like that or if it's possible. And a lot of teachers, they don't really have the capacity to teach that. So I really feel the most important thing is for teachers to practice. And that's what the book is about. And that helps you deal with the burnout and the stress and the conceptual, like, armors, ideas, and, like, you can let go of that through your meditation. Yeah. And it's kind of even deeper than that. I mean, I kind of think of, like, so much of what happens in the classroom isn't really just about the content that's being talked about. You might be teaching about the French Revolution, or you're teaching calculus, or whatever it might be. Or you're just, if you're with really young children, you might be just showing them how to build blocks or how to paint or something like that. But the content is secondary to something else, which is kind of ephemeral, and it's really important, though, which is like, what does it feel like? What is this whole energy of the classroom, the transaction? What's happening there? And that's where the real education is taking place. I think maybe it was Maya Angelou said something like, we forget about what people tell us and teach us, but we don't forget about how they made us feel.
Right.
So that's really where so much of it is happening. And where does that come from? Primarily, or at least a huge factor, is how the teacher feels in the sort of inner culture, in their own state of mind, in their own body, in their own heart. That's the starting place for what the whole outer environment feels like. So,
Right.
so from that point of view,
we all have our favorite teachers, and it's not about what they taught.
Exactly.
Like
Something
Mr.
was about
Williams
what
at
they felt
KC
like.
or-
Yeah.
Yeah. I had like a pretty like traditionally Christian teacher at my high school in Vermont who like I still think about to this day.
Yeah.
He was just magic.
Right. I think everybody has that. They have the one person that stood out for them.
Yeah.
Sometimes people have more than one, but
Right.
what was it about them?
Right.
And so yeah, because it's so deep in that way, I think of teaching as being like a fundamentally existential kind of profession. And I know that's a little heavy for a lot of teachers. They're like, yeah, whatever,
Right.
like teachers tend to be very practical.
Yeah.
This sounds kind of philosophical.
Like what do I do?
Yeah, exactly. They want to know like what are the methods.
I don't have time.
Right.
Right.
But to be honest, like if we want to even think about how we're going to transform education, whether that's just our own experience or our own teaching practice or the big picture of what's happening with education, we have to start with those really, really fundamental assumptions about what we think about human beings. What is education? What's it for?
Right.
Who's it serving? And sometimes cynically, I feel like the education system is built to just sort of further, capitalist aims and corporations and stuff
Right.
like that.
Have you seen in New York Times they're doing a 1619 series? You would love this. So it's about 1619, the year slaves were first brought to the U.S., and it's all about how the educational system in the U.S. like doesn't teach
Right.
any of this stuff.
Right.
And I'm like, oh, whatever. I know about this stuff. Like I'm well read and I care.
Yeah.
And I start reading it, and I'm like, first page, like, oh my God.
Yeah.
The educational system I went through really didn't teach this.
Yeah. Yeah.
Certainly not in any kind of depth.
That's right. Yeah, for sure.
And that's, both shocking and also very inspiring in a way. Like, wow, we really could teach a fuller truth.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. It's
That's
a segue,
okay.
but-
Yeah, so it's true, and I think sometimes teachers talk about like what's the most important thing for students to learn. But I kind of think it's more fundamental than that.
Yeah.
It's like how do they learn, and how do they feel about learning, and because if you have those things and you have a positive relationship with them, you'll learn for your whole life. And you'll keep learning, because obviously we forget a lot of the stuff we learn in school anyways.
Right. Yeah, it's funny. I always say my mom, who is a teacher, and you know her, as a parent, taught me that I was intelligent.
Yeah.
And I remember her teaching me that. And it's such a funny thing to be taught in a way.
Yeah, yeah.
She didn't have any proof. She just was like, oh, you can figure this out. You know this. You're good at this stuff.
Right.
And I was like, yeah, I guess I can read and, I can get through hard things. She made me think I was sort of fundamentally intelligent.
I love that. I had a parent-teacher meeting recently where the student was struggling, but the parents started the meeting by saying, we know that you're intelligent, so let's
Wow.
consider that the container,
Aw.
and you can put more things in the container. It was like, so it's not denying like you have work to do,
Yeah.
but like the fundamental ground is good.
Right.
So like it's sort of trying to remove the whole like
You're a problem.
shame and praise and blame. Like that's not even
Right.
part of it.
Carrot and stick.
Yeah.
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 Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for this book. It's just personally, I was pleasantly surprised how readable it is, how accessible it is.
Cool.
I was saying it's like a Pema Chodron book. It feels very, and I don't mean like you're teaching like Pema Chodron, but Pema Chodron, what I love about her is it just feels like she's talking to you, and it's accessible. It's not like a bunch of theoretical ideas.
Right. Right.
So what, what does this actually offer teachers? Because it's not like a bunch of tips, right?
Right. Right.
But there is practical stuff in it.
For sure, yeah, and I think like as you're kind of pointing to, a lot of stuff in the education world is good and helpful, and like you don't really want to read it in your free time. So much of it is sort of research based and all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So, my book is much more, it's sort of research of experience.
Yeah.
And so it's much more anecdotal and hopefully inspiring. That's the intention of it. And, my experience of teachers, as I mentioned, is like teachers are very practical. When you have an overwhelming job, you're going to get very focused about what do you need and what do you have time to pay attention to.
Right.
And so, in a sense, my book and the work I've done with teachers is saying, like, yes, that's important, but slow down a little bit.
Yeah.
And, like, let's look at the whole premise of how you are as a teacher. And that's going to affect everything that comes afterward.
Yeah.
And
it feels very therapeutic in a way. I can imagine if I were a teacher, like, this is one thing. It's not giving me more armor like we discussed. It's actually, like, helping me.
Yeah. Yeah. So my hope is that all teachers could read this. It's not recommending, for example, a curriculum. It's not giving you a bunch of ideas about
or a philosophy.
Here's things to do in your classroom.
It's not another ideology like Waldorf or Montessori or this. Or
right. No. In fact, in a way, it's kind of asking you to like peel back those layers and see what's before them, because they all have their merits and whatever. But this could be applied to anything, basically. And, my hope is that teachers will find it applicable to their own path. Well, actually, it starts with suggesting that they have a path, which is a novel idea for a lot of people, that you kind of see your profession, let alone your life, as sort of a journey, a learning journey, and something where, you're developing yourself as you go through.
How do people view it? Generally, their teaching career, or
maybe something like that. I mean, I think the notion of path is somewhat unique to spiritual traditions, right? So I don't know, I can't really generalize about how everyone thinks of their lives, but
you feel like people don't view their teaching career as a path.
Often not. Yeah, I mean, they might see it more as a career, and that it's something they're getting better at, but they might not see it as something that also can be a sort of training ground, a sort of dojo, in which they're developing themselves inwardly.
I see. That's beautiful,
Yeah.
Yeah, another segue. I love the dog whisperer, Cesar Millan, and he trains people how to train their dogs who are often have problematic habits. And the first thing he does is he basically trains the person. Yeah. Like, it's not about the dog doing bad stuff. It's like, what are you doing that is, and it's powerful. People go, oh, this is actually helping me in my life. Mm-hmm. Totally outside of the dog.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah, so I really like the work of Parker Palmer. He wrote this book, The Courage to Teach, which has been around for a long time. He's sort of, I think of him as sort of the elder of, sort of the wisdom elder of the teaching world. Yeah,
we have some videos. So if you go to Walk the Talk Show, elephantjournal.com/talk show, we have a couple videos with Parker Palmer. And he's totally walks his talk. Like, he's so dignified and gentle and cheerful. And,
so his work was inspiring to me. And then there's a lot happening now in the mindful education world, which, in the beginning it was some of the work in that domain I felt was kind of immature. Like, it wasn't very well developed, but it's come a long ways.
Cool.
And all of the ones that I have seen that have integrity emphasize, the first thing is you have to work with yourself. And then sometimes they go further to be like, here's how you can implement things in your classrooms and whatnot. So my book is kind of taking that first piece and expanding on it and going a little bit deeper with it, I think.
And then there's excerpts of your book on elephant, if people are curious, right? elephantjournal.com.
There's not actually excerpts, but I wrote articles related to the same themes,
And do any of them link to the book, or how do we find
the
book?
They do, for sure. So I think now I have an author page on elephant. So if you look up Noel McLellan within the authors, is that how it works? And then,
or just search, Noel McLellan, Elephant Journal.
Right.
And then I'm sure if you search Teaching with Bravery, Noel McLellan, you can find out where to
Absolutely, so you'll find my website or the publisher's website, and
great.
It's easy to order.
Well, I'm proud of you, man.
Thanks,
I'm super impressed. Yeah. This is really delightful and relaxing. So it's like not more homework for teachers,
Yeah,
right?
good. Yeah, that was the intention for sure.
Yeah. Awesome. Noel McLellan, childhood best friend.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you, man.